Most people think of cancer as a modern disease, something that comes from pollution, processed food, chemicals in the water, radiation from screens, microplastics in the blood, a disease of civilization, a price we pay for living the way we live now. And on the surface, that makes sense. Cancer rates have exploded in the last 2 centuries. We hear about it constantly. It kills millions of people every single year. It feels new. It feels like something we created. But here's a question that changes everything. What if cancer is older than humanity itself? What if it was already waiting inside the cells of creatures that walked the earth long before we ever existed? What if the very first human beings, the ones who lived in caves, who hunted with sharpened stones, who had never seen a factory or breathed polluted air, were already dying of the same disease that terrifies us today? The answer is one of the strangest and most unsettling truths in all of biology. And it starts not with a human, but with a foot bone buried in a cave in South Africa for nearly 2 million years. In 2016, a team of scientists published a discovery that rewrote the history of cancer. They had been studying fossils from a site called Swartkrans, a limestone cave system in what's known as the cradle of humankind, one of the most fossil-rich regions on the planet. Among the bones they examined was a single metatarsal, a small bone from the foot of an early human ancestor, either Paranthropus robustus or Homo ergaster, dated to roughly 1.7 million years ago. Using high-resolution 3D imaging and computed tomography scans, the researchers looked inside the bone, and what they found was unmistakable. The internal structure showed the hallmarks of osteosarcoma, an aggressive, malignant bone cancer, the same kind of cancer that still kills people today, the same kind that took the life of Canadian runner Terry Fox. It was sitting there, frozen in stone, from a time before our species even existed. That single toe bone became the oldest confirmed case of malignant cancer in the entire human fossil record. But it wasn't alone. In the very same publication, the team announced another discovery from a nearby site called Malapa. A vertebra from a juvenile Australopithecus sediba, dated to 1.98 million years ago, showed evidence of a benign tumor called an osteoid osteoma. It wasn't cancerous in the malignant sense, but it was a growth, an abnormal mass of bone tissue that would have caused pain, limited movement, and may have played a role in the young individual's death. Some researchers believe the child fell from a height, possibly because the tumor made climbing difficult. Before this discovery, the oldest known tumor in a human ancestor was a benign growth found in the rib of a Neanderthal who lived around 120,000 years ago in what is now Croatia. That finding had been considered remarkable at the time, but Swartkrans pushed the timeline back by more than 1 million years. Cancer wasn't a glitch of modernity. It was already written into our biology before we were even human. And here's what makes this even more profound. Cancer didn't start with us. It didn't start with our ancestors. It didn't even start with mammals. The oldest confirmed case of a benign tumor in the fossil record comes from a fish that lived roughly 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period, long before the age of dinosaurs. And dinosaurs themselves were not immune. Researchers have found tumors in Jurassic-era theropods and bone cancer in hadrosaurs from the Cretaceous. In 2020, a study published in The Lancet described osteosarcoma in the leg bone of a Centrosaurus, a horned dinosaur that roamed what is now Alberta, Canada, roughly 75 million years ago. The cancer had advanced so far that the bone was nearly unrecognizable, swollen and deformed, and riddled with damage. A team of paleontologists and pathologists confirmed the diagnosis using the same methods oncologists use on living patients today. Cancer, it turns out, is not a disease of civilization. It is a disease of life. It exists wherever cells divide, and cells had been dividing for billions of years. To understand why early humans got cancer, you have to understand what cancer actually is at its most basic level. It's not a virus. It's not a bacteria. It's not something that invades you from outside. Cancer is your own body making a mistake. Every cell in your body carries a set of instructions, your DNA, that tells it when to grow, when to stop growing, and when to die. Most of the time, this system works. Cells divide, old ones are replaced, damaged ones are removed. But every time a cell copies its DNA, there is a small chance of an error, a mutation. Most mutations are harmless. Some are caught and repaired by your body's built-in proofreading systems. But occasionally, a mutation slips through in exactly the wrong gene. A gene that controls growth, or a gene that controls the self-destruct sequence that tells a damaged cell to shut down. When that happens, the cell doesn't stop. It keeps dividing, and its copies keep dividing. And eventually, you have a mass of cells that are growing without purpose, consuming resources, invading surrounding tissue, and sometimes spreading to distant parts of the body. That's cancer. And it doesn't require pollution or processed food or industrial chemicals. It just requires cells. The longer an organism lives, the more times its cells divide, and the more chances there are for something to go wrong. This is where the biggest myth about ancient cancer falls apart. There's a widely repeated claim that cancer is a modern, man-made disease. In 2010, researchers at the University of Manchester published a review arguing exactly that. They pointed to the scarcity of cancer in the archaeological record and the rarity of the disease in ancient texts, and concluded that cancer was essentially created by modern lifestyles. The claim made headlines around the world, but the scientific community pushed back hard. Cancer Research UK called the conclusions misleading and unwarranted. Other researchers pointed out several critical problems with the argument. First, people in the ancient world simply didn't live as long. Cancer is overwhelmingly a disease of aging. The risk increases dramatically after the age of 50, and for many cancers, the peak risk is after 65. In ancient populations, average life expectancy was between 30 and 50 years, and most people died of infection, injury, childbirth, or malnutrition long before cancer had a chance to develop. It's not that cancer didn't exist, it's that most people didn't survive long enough to get it. Second, cancer is incredibly difficult to detect in the archaeological record. The vast majority of cancers originate in soft tissue, organs, glands, the lining of the stomach, the lungs, the liver, and soft tissue decomposes. It's gone within years of burial. All that's left is bone. And even cancers that do spread to bone often start from the inside, from the marrow outward, meaning the exterior of the bone can look perfectly normal while the interior is devastated. For thousands of years, researchers only examined the outside surface of ancient bones. They were looking at the shell and missing what was hidden beneath it. A landmark study from the University of Cambridge in 2021 proved just how much was being missed. Researchers used X-rays and CT scans to examine 143 skeletons from 6 medieval cemeteries in and around Cambridge, England, dating from the 6th to the 16th century. Previous studies, based only on visual inspection, had estimated that cancer affected less than 1% of medieval populations. But when the Cambridge team looked inside the bones, they found signs of malignancy in 5 individuals, a minimum prevalence of 3.5%, after adjusting for the fact that CT scans only catch bone metastases about 75% of the time, and that only a third to a half of people who die of cancer show spread to the bones. The researchers estimated that the true cancer rate in medieval Britain was somewhere between 9 and 14%. That's not rare. That's not a disease that didn't exist yet. That's a disease that was hiding in plain sight, in bones that looked normal on the outside but were quietly being destroyed from within. And when you look even further back, long before medieval England, the evidence keeps appearing. In 2014, archaeologists from Durham University unearthed a skeleton in a tomb at Amara West, in what is now northern Sudan. The individual was a young man, estimated to be between 25 and 35 years old, who had been buried around 1200 BC, more than 3,000 years ago. When researchers examined his bones using radiography and scanning electron microscopy, they found something devastating: osteolytic lesions. Areas where the bone had been eaten away by disease covered his vertebrae, ribs, sternum, collarbones, shoulder blades, pelvis, and the heads of his upper arm and thigh bones. The cancer had spread everywhere. It was in nearly every major bone in his body. The researchers diagnosed metastatic carcinoma, a cancer that had originated in a soft tissue organ somewhere in his body and then spread aggressively to his skeleton. He became the oldest complete example of a human being with metastatic cancer ever found. A young man, probably in pain for months or years. In a world with no concept of chemotherapy, no surgery, no painkillers beyond whatever plants his community could gather, he suffered and he died. And the cancer left its fingerprints in his bones for 3,000 years. But here's something that most people don't realize. Ancient humans weren't just dying of cancer. Some of them were trying to fight it. In 2024, researchers studying two ancient Egyptian skulls from the Duckworth collection at the University of Cambridge made a discovery that stunned the scientific community. One of the skulls, labeled 236, belonged to a man who had died between 2687 and 2345 BCE, more than 4,000 years ago. Previous analysis had already identified a large primary tumor and around 30 smaller metastatic lesions scattered across his skull. But when the team examined the skull under a digital microscope and micro-CT scanner, they found something no one expected. Cut marks. Small, precise, deliberate incisions made with a sharp metal tool right at the edges of the cancerous growths. Someone had taken a blade to this man's skull and tried to cut the cancer out, or, at the very least, they had tried to understand it. The researchers couldn't determine whether the cuts were made before or shortly after death, which means this was either one of the earliest cancer surgeries in human history or one of the earliest medical autopsies. Either way, it was evidence that ancient Egyptians weren't just aware of cancer, they were investigating it. They were trying to intervene. This shouldn't surprise us, even if it does. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surgical documents ever found, dates back to roughly 3000 BC and describes 8 cases of breast tumors. The ancient physician who wrote it examined these growths by touch and by sight, described their characteristics in clinical detail, and in at least one case wrote plainly that there was no treatment. That single line, written nearly 5,000 years ago, carries a weight that echoes through every oncology ward in the modern world. Even then, they knew some things couldn't be fixed. So if cancer has existed for millions of years, if it was afflicting dinosaurs and ancient fish, and early hominids and Neanderthals and ancient Egyptians, why does it feel so much more common now? Because it is more common now, but not for the reasons most people assume. The single biggest factor is age. We live dramatically longer than any generation of humans before us. In the developed world, average life expectancy has more than doubled in the last 2 centuries. That means billions of people are now reaching the age window where cancer risk skyrockets, an age most ancient humans never lived to see. As the oncologist Siddhartha Mukherjee wrote, civilization didn't cause cancer. By extending human lifespans, it unveiled it. But longevity is only part of the story. Modern environmental factors do play a role. Tobacco use, which didn't become widespread until the last few centuries, is directly responsible for a massive increase in lung and throat cancers. Industrial chemicals, air pollution, ultraviolet radiation exposure, alcohol consumption, obesity, and processed diets have all been linked to increased cancer risk. These aren't the origin of cancer, but they are accelerants. They take a biological process that already existed and pour fuel on it. There's also an evolutionary dimension that most people never consider. Some of the DNA repair genes that protect us from cancer carry their own mutations. Mutations that actually increase cancer risk. A 2025 study published in Genome Biology found that many of these pathogenic variants in human DNA damage repair genes arose within the last 10,000 years, after the most recent migration of modern humans out of Africa. The high cancer risk caused by these mutations is, in effect, a byproduct of human evolution itself. Our own genetic history, the same process that made us who we are, introduced vulnerabilities that cancer exploits. And then there's the deepest question of all. If cancer is this ancient, this fundamental, this built into the machinery of life, why hasn't evolution gotten rid of it? The answer is both simple and brutal. Evolution doesn't care about you after you've reproduced. Natural selection favors traits that help an organism survive long enough to pass on its genes. Once you've had children, once your genetic material is in the next generation, the selective pressure drops sharply. Cancer overwhelmingly strikes after reproductive age. A mutation that causes cancer at 70 has almost no evolutionary cost, because by 70, your genes are already in your grandchildren. Evolution doesn't select against late-onset diseases the way it selects against threats to the young. And some of the very mechanisms that promote cancer, rapid cell division, tissue regeneration, aggressive immune responses, are the same mechanisms that keep you alive when you're young. The biology that heals a wound or fights an infection in your 20s is the same biology that decades later can spin out of control and become a tumor. Evolution didn't fail to remove cancer. Cancer is the shadow side of the same systems that make complex life possible. Large, long-lived animals face this paradox head-on. You might expect that bigger animals with more cells would get cancer at higher rates. They don't. Elephants carry extra copies of the TP53 gene, one of the most powerful tumor suppressors in nature. Bowhead whales, which can live for more than 200 years, have evolved extraordinarily efficient DNA repair mechanisms. Naked mole rats, which can live for over 30 years, are nearly immune to cancer through a combination of unique cellular chemistry and tissue architecture. Evolution has, in certain lineages, found ways to manage the risk. But in humans, those defenses are imperfect. We live long, our cells divide billions of times, and the odds eventually catch up. What all of this tells us is something that should fundamentally change how you think about this disease. Cancer is not a punishment. It's not a consequence of doing something wrong. It's not something that was invented by factories or unleashed by chemicals. It is the oldest price of being alive. It was there in the bones of creatures that walked the earth before the continents looked the way they do now. It was there in the spines of dinosaurs that grazed across floodplains 75 million years ago. It was there in the foot of a human ancestor stumbling through the South African bush nearly 2 million years before anyone built a city or lit a cigarette or poured a chemical into a river. And it was there in a young man buried in the sands of Nubia 3,000 years ago, whose bones carried the unmistakable scars of a disease that had spread through his entire skeleton. He had no name that survived, no record of his life, no story that anyone wrote down. All that remains is the evidence of what his body endured, preserved in calcium and stone, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. Cancer has been part of the story of life on this planet for as long as cells have been dividing. It is not new. It is not modern. It is ancient in a way that makes the word ancient feel small. And the fact that we are now finally beginning to understand it, to fight it, to push back against something that has been killing living things for hundreds of millions of years, that might be the most remarkable chapter in the entire history of medicine. If this changed the way you think about cancer or about how long diseases have been shaping life on Earth, consider subscribing. There are so many questions about the living world that have answers far stranger and more fascinating than most people ever hear, and we're just getting started.